Hello everyone, this is Brady. I was kind of busy these days, but I think it's time to make some tutorials. This is the icing on donuts animation that I have done in the past. The design comes from Sebastian on Facebook using the same tool as I am doing today. I actually lost the initial reference, so I almost forgot what his animation looks like exactly. Today, I am going to use a method which is a little bit different from his, but the most basic principle will be the same. In fact, this technique is basically just a Remesh modifier, which I have talked in my cellular division animation tutorial. Anyway, let's start. Firstly, let's talk about the Remesh modifier. So if I get a cube, and I just put that aside, and then I'm putting a UV sphere. And in this UV sphere, so this is a feature in Blender. As far as I know, it's not available in Cinema 4D. That's within the same object, I can duplicate the mesh. So it becomes two separate mesh, but they are in the same object, which also means you can put a subdivision surfaces, and it will apply to both meshes, which is kind of convenient, but it also generates a lot of issue that I will discuss later. But at this moment, if I just put this sphere and overlapping the other one, and you can see the intersection part is very hard. And if you go to the wireframe, you can see it's just the intersection. And it's very ugly, honestly speaking. And the subdivision surface obviously will not remove this hard intersection, because subdivision is essentially applied to each mesh separately. It's just a kind of more convenient way you add one subdivision surfaces but applying to different meshes at the same time. Of course, you can definitely duplicate more sphere, but it does not change anything. Here's a very interesting thing that you have to think about, is that because these volumes is not grouped together, which means if I add a Boolean modifier and the operation type to the difference, and I try to use 3 balls to cut out a surface on this cube, and what you can see is that due to you can see the Boolean modifier is not working properly. This is very unfortunate. Actually, it's not working properly at all. It's not only that you see such kind of the kind of protruding part, it's also that it does not remove the other part of the sphere. Simply because the Boolean modifier is much confused by whatever the thing that you have happens to these meshes. So there's one way to solve this problem, however, is that you can add a Remesh modifier. So what the Remesh modifier is doing is basically it will calculate the volume of objects, especially the voxel part. It will calculate the volume and and give it a new kind of topology. So you can see all these lines and the points are no longer the same as the original one. But on the other side, it gives you a kind of very interesting, a smooth intersection edges. And if you would like to give more accuracy, you just decrease the voxel size. Then it becomes more accurate. Obviously, you can also add a subdivision surface, but I do not recommend you to do so. Another thing you need to know is that if you would like to smooth shading, shade smooth won't actually work. You have to turn on this smooth shading instead. Okay. I don't recommend to add a subdivision surfaces because it will be super slow. So usually I think this is just good. And now if we take a look with our cubes, now it actually works perfectly fine, because now this sphere is actually 100%, it has been remeshed to a 100% shared volume that has no intersection. As you can see, there's no part that's intersecting the volume. So the cube definitely knows how to Boolean itself. So this is actually a kind of very important. Might be interesting in the future, but now this is just a concept, which might be useful at this moment. Anyway, what I want to say, however, is that so now we know the effects to smooth out all these kind of different meshes, and it's very important for my cellular division animation and icing on donut animation. There is, however, one issue in Blender. working with such kind of setup is that you cannot control all these kind of different sphere parametrically. You cannot use the transform. It does not actually work because the transform works on the whole object. And there is no other ways. There's essentially ways that you can potentially use shape keys, but it's actually not. It's just a workaround, and it's not for complicated stuff. There's the only parametrical way that I discovered is to use this M panel, goes to ident and the transform. You can try to change all these values. So this is one way to do that. However, it also has a problem that this part is not keyframeable. You cannot hit I or anything. It's just done once for all. And it's still very dumb way to actually control all this stuff separately. So this is something that you have to think about while working around with such a thing. And that's why we need to use either Switchlock or animation nodes. Both of them should be fine, and even the shortcut should be fine, I think. Okay. Yeah, I think I removed the shortcut, but anyway. This is just a kind of idea. I think in the future, due to the everything nodes project, the Blender might have its built-in the modeling node-based system, but at least now and in the short term, I do not expect anything like that to happen. So you have to use either animation node or Switchlock. And in this particular tutorial, I'm going to use animation node for sure because I feel more comfortable with that. So to create a donut, first thing that we need to do is basically to take a torus. And I want you to realize that there is a panel which you can control all these parameters. For example, change the segments, you can decrease the segments. You can also change the radius. Major radius is just basically the size. For the minor radius is actually the thickness. So I think minor radius is more important than major radius or whatever. However, this panel is not a procedural because if you hit elsewhere, it disappears. It's gone once for all. Personally speaking, I don't know if there is any way to make it back, and I'm afraid the answer is no. You cannot make it back. Okay. So you have to generate another torus until the panel goes on. But here's another way, personally speaking, to fix this issue, or kind of fix this issue. So in edit mode, normally if you scale up and down, hit S, it's just the scale up and down, right? But if you hit Alt S, then it will scale all these faces along its normals. So these faces will be scaled towards that direction. So it gives us such kind of workaround that you can fix the minor radius issues using Alt S. And until you finally get a torus that's a kind of donut that you like. And you can definitely shade smooth it. But the shade smooth actually does not really matter because it actually just does not matter. The next thing I want you to realize is that because we're going to use the Remesh modifier, it means everything needs to be within the same mesh. So to duplicate a torus, you can use array modifier. You can use animation nodes or Switchlock, but you can also use array modifier. Where's my array modifier? Yes, so you can use array modifier. You can increase the count. Actually, this is kind of more easy way instead of taking several nodes in this node tree. And this is the way that we are going to instance these donuts. And definitely it's procedural because it's modifier. So this is one part. I actually don't really like array modifier because you cannot offset the entire donuts. But I think it's a kind of easy way for you to actually understand how to duplicate this entire mesh or so. The next thing I'm going to create is to create a curtain. Basically just a plane, and it goes to edit modes, scale, something like that. And this curtain will be fine. Okay, so this is basically it. You can name that as a curtain. And donuts, original donuts. Original donuts without E. Okay. So basically this is our basic setup. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually to generate a boolean, and you will know the usage of this boolean. To actually make this boolean, I'm just going to duplicate this mesh, and probably move this curtain a little bit away. And I'm going to basically just extrude that give a kind of box and name that the boolean. And basically this is good already. And then we're going to use animation nodes to basically procedurally merge these two meshes together. In terms of animation node, what we're going to do is actually pretty simple. You just hit Ctrl A and search for object mesh data node. It's actually good enough. And I'm going to duplicate that. One to select our original donuts, and the other to actually select the curtains. Very simple and straightforward. Then I'm going to create this object, mesh list. This is a procedural way to combine these two mesh together. And once we join the mesh, it means we also need to output this mesh object. So using the mesh object output node, and finally take the mesh, generates a target object, which is cool. So let's name that as with with icing. If I disable the others, and you can see our object, and you do realize some problem with this object. We didn't duplicate our donuts. Why? The reason is because we didn't use this use modifier, so the array modifier has not been taken into account. So after this moment, if you would like to give get a very quick result, you can simply just to get a Remesh modifier, and instantaneously you can see this kind of the smooth joinment on both sides. Okay, which is I think it's kind of very cool. You also realize the issue is because if you think this is the animation that we've made, for example, you take a texture, and what you obviously want is the other side should have a different color. Okay. So there are multiple ways to solve this problem. What I'm going to do is basically just to clean up all the donuts on the other side. And to do so, we are going to use the boolean modifier. And I'm going to put the booleans in before, because you can definitely try, but if you put the booleans on the back, it will actually cause some problems sometimes. And then just take a boolean, everything being fast. So this is actually, I think this is kind of cool. So the next question that you will be wondering, okay, is so what we're going to do with the other side of the donuts? How can we actually get them back? In such a case, I'm going to duplicate these mesh object outputs, put the original donuts into the sockets, and generate another target object. In this target object, I'm going to name that as a without icing. So this time, I need to clean up the boolean. I'm going to clean up the donuts on the other side of curtain. So I'm still going to use the boolean modifier, select the same boolean object, but this time I'm going to change the operation into the intersect. So now we have two donuts that has two different colors. This is completely procedural because they are regulated by the same boolean object. So if you change these boolean objects, then it will change all these kind of things. But usually you probably don't want to change that. And basically this is actually done. Actually, these 6 nodes is almost everything that you need. Definitely you can take more. So this is one. So this is honestly speaking almost done. The next thing I would like to talk about is to make kind of this curtain more kind of realistic. So what to do with it? So I have this curtain. You might think that if we are going to more making kind of a liquid effects, let's add a subdivision surfaces, make it simple, increase the subdivision count. So if we turn off these optimal displays, and then we can see all this wireframe. If we turn on this ultimate display, then we do not see this wireframe. Okay, so now we have all these kind of subdivisions. Let's add a displace modifier and just add a new textures. Take the type into clause. I have an empty created as a default, so I just need to select these objects. Let's name that as displace. So by moving this empty, then I can generate kind of a flow kind of effect. If you would like to smooth out it more, just to take another subdivision surfaces and keep everything as default, it will be fine. You can also add a solidify modifier, and I think this is good enough. Okay. So this is good. However, if you take a look with icing, so let's disable this curtain. Because we use the modifier, you may think, let's use this modifier, and immediately you can see this effect is kind of weird. This is almost a limitation, and based on your parameter, sometimes it can behave differently. Like sometimes you might have nothing left for these curtains. It'll basically just never being really completed. And from my experience, it's the issue of Remesh modifier. It's not the issue of the node, it's the Remesh modifier. And by decreasing the voxel size, it will actually not helping the problem very much. You also need a lot of luck to work on this setup. There's no guarantee about how it actually will be fixed. No any guarantee actually. So it totally depends on luck. So sometimes you might not have a luck at all. It may not work at all. So it just be careful with whatever you are facing with. So instead of so now I have a pretty much luck that I have a quite good curtain, but this is not actually good enough, whatever. So you just keep that to 0.1. Even if it's not completed, just leave it not completed. What I'm going to do probably is duplicate the curtain. It does not matter if you duplicate the curtain or not. You may not even need to use it. Just disable this modifier. Just to know that I'm going to leave another curtain and change the material to icing. And by increasing the solidify modifier, I'm actually hiding the original plane. And you can also decide whether to take this displacement a little bit down or up. It does not really matter. It's just kind of giving kind of results. Taking that to 1. Just to hide the original plane, and I think it should be fine because you can essentially still see this kind of rounded edges protruding out, and it will be fine. In the actual animation, I don't think people actually will realize this effect. So basically, it's doing the same. So almost this is done. One last thing that I would like to remind you is for this shade smooth. So this donut looks kind of very jaggy, because it's not a shade, it's a shaded flat. So if you turn on the shade smooth, it will fix the issue. However, if you execute the node tree, it will go back again. The reason has been discussed in my tutorial that specifically discusses this mesh object input node or object mesh data node. So the way to fix that is actually simple. You just take a shaded object smooth node, plug that in. So instead of using the shaded smooth manually, you're using the nodes procedurally to shade smooth these donuts, and you get a very nice result. So now I have everything basically been done, and I have an original donuts. I'm putting the original donuts into the control collection because the control collection is being set with the auto execution. All these things has been explained in my other tutorial, so you can go to the link on the right upper corner if you are not sure about what I'm talking about on this trigger. But basically, with all this kind of setup, if I change in the displacement or the location, the scale, rotation, then it will update the node tree, which also means if I'm changing these original donuts So let's hide that. If I'm changing this original donuts, okay, it's not actually working. For example, if I change this parameter, then I'm moving the entire things, which also means you can keyframe these original donuts and you can animate this entire thing. So this is it. Here is one issue that I want to remind you is that here is the object mesh data node is using modifier at this moment, but the design of Blender is that if you disable this collection, then the modifier of this object will not be read. It's expected to improve the performance of a computer, because why would you want to render or access the modifier of an object that will never be rendered? So it's expected behavior, but it's causing problem because now we disable this control panel and I lost all this array modifier. Okay. So one way to solve this issue is to you simply disable this eye icon. So never the screen icon, not the screen icon, but this eye icon. You disable this eye icon, turn on the user modifier, and instead of render this viewport, render the animation by Control F12, you need to use this viewport render animation. It will solve your problem. However, there are some people who are actually compositing the entire animation they do. I never do that. I do everything in After Effects. But some people they do. And if you render viewport animation, the compositing will never be a choice. I think it will not be composited. So how can we actually fix this problem? If you cannot disable this screen, not disable the render, not disable the collection, how can we solve this problem? So instead, using array modifier to duplicate these entire donuts, a very easy way to solve the issue is to duplicate our donuts within the animation nodes. There is a preset that I've discussed in the past, which is called instancing collection. It's actually pretty simple. You just take a transform mesh node, and using a distribute matrices, and I'm only going to distribute on x-axis, put the matrices into the place, mesh into the mesh, and then basically use the new mesh to duplicate that. So now let's see what we actually read. Where's my donuts? So now you see actually the donuts. Let's not use the word space, and then it will fix all the issue. So this is a procedural way, another procedural way to duplicate the donuts without using the array modifier. And this is basically good. And you can definitely change all these parameters. It's completely procedural. And to animate that, there are billions ways. And in this case, definitely you can try to disable these renders. I think it will cause no problems for yet. So once you have done all these kind of things, if you would like to animate the movement of the donuts, you also need to use a node. Let's transform matrices. And let's duplicate a displacement, duplicate a entity. Let's name that as a control. Take an object matrix input. So now if we try to move this control, then it will move all these matrices. These matrices are distributed. So if you take a 3D view, you can take a look with all these matrices. So basically the donut has been instanced on all these matrices. And by using object matrix input node, I'm linking the location of this control to the matrices that has been generated with this node. And now I can definitely move them so that the donuts has also been moved. And it's a way to animate that. and be aware with what it actually happens is that you do have this kind of smooth effects due to the Remesh modifier. And so you can keyframe one control to animate the movement of donuts, and then you can keyframe another empty that changes the displacement. And this is almost all about it. The rest is something that you have to model by yourself, tweaking the values, whatever stuff. But the basic principle of this animation is being taught. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.